primeiro.
So let's move forward. Let's look first of all at digital journalism, and then we're going to talk about these media groups and how technology is changing. We're going to start with digital journalism.
Claro que também os.
Of course, journalism can't be an exception when we're looking at the future and the implications of the transformations and digital transitions. So this has been going on in journalism for quite a while now, and whether we know how to make this transition or not, that could be a starting point for my guess. We have Bernardo Correio and Rita Figueiras and Antonio Costa. As he says, he's aware about it. Thank you. Welcome to the three of you. Let's look at digital journalism, and I'd like to begin with Antonio. I'll start with you and look and see how. Let's try and take stock of what's going on. We now read newspapers, no longer in paper, but in different supports: a tablet, computer, and mobile phone. And so they said it was going to die, journalism was going to die, but that wasn't the case. How difficult is it? Well, first of all, good afternoon to everybody, and I would like to thank Mr. Kerepusa for the invitation to be here. I'm used to asking questions than giving answers, but it's easier being in your position. But let's see, we have to point out the fact that journalism is journalism. It has its own rules, it's got its own good code of ethics, principles, objectives to inform, to help decide, to monitor. And this doesn't change whether we're writing for a medium which is a written medium, that is a paper, or digital. Now, digital journalism, up to a certain extent, or transformation, or models like ECHO, which is not in paper. We have media in paper and have excellent editions online. But today we have media which are totally online, and the online journalism. And I didn't make a transition, I just went straight online. And another point that I think are important, do they add anything to the challenge we have? Well, I think that they do help the readers. On the one hand, the data. No doubt, in this Congress, you'll have spoken about data journalism, and so there must be timely decisions which are relevant. I'm talking about a director to decide on the first page of a newspaper, and he will only know the effects and the results of this first page 3 or 4 days later, which makes it very difficult, as you can imagine, to make decisions. That is, to know whether that is history or the headlines actually what I mean. The experience helped us to outline a number of decisions, but today digital journalism has immediate aspects, and so in this industry we would think it'd be impossible to make decisions without information, without data. This is an advantage for journalists, it's an advantage for readers, we can all decide, and also it's an advantage in the choice. And the second aspect of digital journalism, which brought something new, that is, it became more demanding. It is easy to change sites. That is, you buy a newspaper and you may like it more or less, but you create a connection with it. I mean, it's like the television. You've got the remote control in your hand, and here we have the same thing. And this creates a greater risk. And every day, and I talk about the time with the team. There's less time, and see the competitiveness of other media, and so we're competing with everybody. we're competing with Netflix, with Google, Facebook, and in terms of attention, in terms of time. So, for example, there's change when we talk about digital journalism. We're not only talking about an article, we're talking about a video. It's much more complete, and an ability to talk about different forms of journalism and to be the ability to interact with the reader immediately. But time brings with it its own difficulties and its own risks. That is a great decision-making process that can lead to more mistakes, and perhaps this is the main risk that digital journalism can have. But these can be corrected. That we know, for example, when there's it's in paper, it comes out with the error. The error it could be a typo and can be corrected. And so we have to share this error with the readers. And so the risk is more obvious because the competitors and the logic of digital journalism is not to keep the news. Just a third thing to say is that proximity, which I have to say to an extent you had implicit in your observation, the proximity of readers, I think, and the digital news is with us all the time. It's on our mobile phones, and sort of this creates a relationship with, a stronger relationship with the readers. Before I give the floor to Bernardo, and so we talked about the role of Google and others. So how do you, as a publisher, how do you see the digital format for the production of these articles? As partners, basically as partners, I make a disclaimer here. The ECO and Google have, in Portugal, a partnership, and we have had the availability of Google to work with us. There has been the idea, the responsibility of the readers, the journalists, with the dynamics of things. And so this was social media. I've got nothing against any different types of social media, but I mean, it brings things with us, but it's not a social. It's a medium, but it's not social media. Up to a certain extent that the social media, I think there used to be confusion about what it was, but nowadays it's clearer. It's excess information. It makes people more demanding. So I'm talking about a segment of the market of readers that are demanding with the type of information, and the different brands, the different excellent brands out there. And we have to think about Twitter, Facebook, and different. So the dissemination they make and the number of people that they bring to read these articles and the product could lead to the loss of business. I don't know. This is a path. So the process has been discussed for years now. In the case of Google, then I was invited Bernardo to make a reflection with us. There's an added value in partnerships, and there was, and I would say there still is, but we are on a pathway to make a fair share of contents. And Google brings a lot of people to ECHO, and all the journalists want the same thing. Well, maybe not. Some want to survive as well. So journalists want something. They want to get as many readers as possible. And obviously platforms like Google, like Facebook and Twitter allow this. And so the companies, media companies, obviously have objectives which are enshrined in the editorial statutes that they have, but they have a duty to, they must be independent. So we have to underline the effort that has been made. We're still going through a process, but we're sharing income, business, which is more balanced now because Google, to conclude, but Google and other partners do not live without local means, and that's the balance that you have to find. So we haven't reached any conclusion, but everything is an evolution. Everybody continues with their own points of view. So what I would like to hear from you is to know up to what point in digital journalism there is a more specific sharing of the digital journalism, because lots of journalists use Google to make their own contents, and some but big newspapers and small paper. So is the relationship more peaceful? Good afternoon, everybody, and I would like to thank Antonio for his words. Well, the path that we have been following is this. We have to remind people that a search engine is very different from a social network, and Google lives by definition, by mission, in a symbiotic relationship with all other partners that create contents, where they were talking about Wikipedia or whatever. And so maybe I have to go back and remember what the mission of Google is and why does Google exist. I was looking at Google I/O, and we remember that after 24 years we are still with this. We still have the same mission, and that is to inform people and make this information useful. Because this is important, despite the news being only 2% of all the search in Google, very small number, it is a content with enormous social importance. In order to avoid any confusion, we don't have any ads in Google News because it's so small. We don't have many readers. We don't even have the Google News has not been monetized, but it's very important for people to have access to this quality content, and this user must have the right answer to the right question with the right authority. Because Google has two components to give a quality answer, that is relevance, and that is authority. That is the right answer. It must come from an authority that can say that the answer is correct. And our mission, and over the last 7 or 8 years, I think Google has been extraordinary. That is through the traffic, 8 billion clicks every month. We have tools. Over 90% of the revenue shared with the publishers who manage it, subscriptions, and through innovation. Innovation Fund in Portugal financed something like 8 million euros. So in terms of innovation projects, I mean the Radio Observer and the Digital News Initiative financed this and others. And this old myth that Google didn't pay for content. Let me answer a question. So when you talk about authority and relevance, to what extent does Google not have a mission which is not yours? To choose who's relevant. So this is a very pertinent question. And this is, this underlines all the problems and doubts that we have, and maybe Rita is the best person to answer this. If nobody wants Google to decide what's 100% truth or false, it's like going to a library and ask the man at the door which book has got the truth. There isn't one. I mean, there can be thousands of books in a library, and some can be wrong. But they're not right. But there's a decision about the books that you display in a library. I mean, of course, it's all a question of visibility. I think that it is up to us to, within legality, to make all content available. Within this, there's a question of raising the voices of authority in cases that are more complicated, climate change, for example, and to make them more relevant. And we are helping inform. And so we answer the request of journalism, and that is to recognize that social media is an authority that maybe not all have. And one of our partners is ECHO itself, and so we allowed the license of media content. And so this content with a great could be highlighted in the Google search. Rita Figueiras, as an academic, the question of digital journalism is it the type of journalism that we're going to have in the future? What kind of revolution will it be in terms of journalism? Good afternoon, everybody. I would like to thank you for the invitation for me to be here present. The relationship between journalism and technology has existed since the 19th century. I'm not going to give you a history lesson about journalism, but the telegraphist was important for journalism to no longer be focused on what was actually happening in one single spot to extend the geography. On the other hand, it's fundamental. So if you could publish information without this, the message of this information traveling, it could be go through Morse code, and this allowed that something that happened far away could be published without the message having to make the physical transmit to know exactly what happened at the time. There was a huge revolution. That is, we shortened the distances and to expand the agenda of journalism. So it was a revolution in its time in order to move now onto the present. It's obvious that the journalism at the time was transformed direct. We think it's quite normal to have things live, and it's via satellite, etc. So technology has always transformed journalism, and journalism has always adjusted itself to the disruption that each journalism brought. So as so that is with the entrance of the digital age, things have changed, and so this business model is not so sort of taken place, and journalism has had more autonomy in its action because it was led by the logic of algorithms, which is asymmetric. It decides what should have more visibility. And so this is in the sphere of journalism. So in the studies, it's a sort of self-criticism. I know what's going to have an audience, but that doesn't motivate me. How can that condition us? Well, not because of the self-censorship, but because due to the criteria of what is newsworthy, and so to find out what works better in terms of distribution and in terms of the amplification of message. This is always the case, but now it's quicker and there are more instruments. And the asymmetry is greater because the negotiating possibility of journalism has decreased. So greater asymmetry and a greater opacity, in the sense that we should know how the algorithms work, but we don't. And the companies know these platforms, They know the users well. They know how the media function, but we can't say the same thing for these platforms. So this is the greatest change. There's an asymmetry, and so this change brings does it bring risks? Do these risks bring risks in its mission? Well, there are always risks, but also there's another angle with it is from the point of view of readers, users, and studies have indicated and indicate more and more the loss of capacity to identify the journalist brands. For example, when you receive in the feed tutorials on makeup, photographs of a breakfast and news, that is for those who do not have this knowledge, and everything is diluted because it looks as if it's the same thing. And so if you think about the younger generation that's lived in this context, I mean, the brands on paper, the consumption of traditional media has dissolved somewhat, not only through platforms but through the mobile phone, which is another dimension of what is the consumption of mobility, because this is done in multitasking. Do you think that from the perspective of the user, it is the user is more passive in relation to the situation, or the fact that he knows more digitally speaking and could be making choice, smart to make a smart choice? Well, the different studies that have been made on this is that there's a sort of polarization aspect, that is those who had consumer habits and wanted to consume more. It feels wonderful because look at he can go around the world in a minute on his mobile phone, and there's a plurality of forms with the specific newsletters, has access to the international media subscriptions, podcasts, and so there's a huge number of possibilities to have different complementary information to address a certain topic. But there's another extreme. That is, everything is very overwhelming. There's too much information that people have a great difficulty in separating everything. And just so people are left with the idea that everything's confusing. And so in one place it says one thing, and then another place it says another thing, and then you don't know. And this idea that different information appears all the time, and so these people have a difficulty in understanding what we should understand. Antonio. What is the truth? What is the lie? What is the lie? In terms of what I'm going to consume, how do we fight this information, which is the greatest enemy of clarifying public opinion at a time when we know this from our daily practice, because quite often our viewers or readers believe in Facebook or Twitter than in the news, which takes longer.
So, first of all, misinformation has always existed, but technology has made things much different. There is something regarding your question that I'd like to qualify. Journalists and the media, social media especially, and especially in the last few years, given a series of factors, have a very relevant social value, but they don't have such an economic value compared to platforms such as search platforms like Google or other social media, that they have economic value. I think this makes the capability of journalists and newspapers and social media to help or contribute to fight against fake news or misinformation. It's very simple but very difficult to enact. It requires means and time, and there is the added pressure, but it also requires for each journalist and each means of communication to know exactly, each medium, what their purpose is, on the one hand, and to see what their obligations are as journalists. I think that there's a difference between the time we have to check the news, which will only be published when we have cross-checked or fact-checked with several. But at the same time, the platforms are circulating the fake news. Yes, fakes are very sophisticated. I don't think it's a battle that we have lost yet. What does the public think? There are some groups that are well prepared to draft information and digest it, but others are not. And some readers or users, that I don't like the word user, but whatever, that consume information via the social media. And a large percentage of these people, it's going to be difficult to conquer them. Let's not be fatalistic. We have to do our job, which is journalism, and help people make decisions and scrutinize. There is no silver bullet. There's no magic wand. The technology gives us important tools for digital journalism, and this has to do with platforms, with the capacity to invest. I've come across some realities in which there are journals that have a ratio of developers. There's 3 journalists for each developer. But that's not the case for Portugal, unfortunately. There's going to be a discussion with the CEOs to talk about the business, but these are difficulties that we encounter. There are difficulties, there are stumbling blocks, there are problems with the digitalization. But there are also tools. We have Google, there are other tools available, and some of them are even free. If we were to have more investment capacity, we'd be using technology to combat fake news. But as I said, there's no silver bullet or magic wand to solve everything from one day to the next. And we're not going to end with the fake news. How can we help fight against fake news? Misinformation or fake news is not only bad, it can be very harmful, and we shouldn't echo it. If this or that became viral and it's not true, then we shouldn't give it more publicity than it deserves, which is none. It's not a new thing, of course, even in technology, it's not a new thing. So whomsoever has an email account may have a spam inbox, and you might receive 100 times more spam than real messages, at least in Gmail. So we have to filter many harmful or spamful emails. So, well, that's another dimension, of course, yes, in which a tweet or a picture on Instagram or a story or a publication on Facebook has much more coverage than a real news in the newspaper, and these fakes become viral. Well, I spoke about Google, there are many other platforms too, but obviously we have YouTube, which is not exactly a social media, but does have some components of such. And perhaps the most important thing here, if we go back to brokering, and the powers of algorithms that may decide on this or that. The situation is not 100% in algorithms or something analog. It's a bit hybrid. And the world is a showcase, like Antonio said a while ago, that enables the content producers to have panels available. And it's the media who decide what's going to be published on the panels. We have the editorial boards that decide what's most relevant for the panel. And then we have the algorithm side. So there is a hybrid situation between human brokering with the editors and the machine. I think that's the future for our profession. Regarding what you just said, there are 3 main themes that we have to do better. There are no perfect algorithms, like there are no perfect human beings, there never will be. And the internet is constantly changing. So we have to make sure that content is not in violation of anything. And we need real policies to remove hateful content or racist content and give more power to authoritarian content. So it's not a one-stop shop, but we should highlight what is true. We should also see how we manage the payment for this kind of journalism. There was a question of a certain medium that decided not to pay for content which was against climate change, but they decided not to withdraw the content, but to not pay for it. Just like I was saying, it's not authoritarian content, and it goes against the interests of society. I think we have these three facets. So if we are capable of juggling these three elements, removing fake news, not paying for it, and becoming authoritative, then we might have the way forward. But the question is, how do you make the decision, and who makes the decision, considering that you might decide a certain article goes against this or that, or an article that might be defending that there is climate change, but that has some misinformation in it with a commercial underlying reason. Well, there's a lot in YouTube that should be removed, in my opinion, but at the end of the day, it's the same old story. In YouTube, there's an algorithm that reviews the content and tries to remove anything that is harmful. And then we have a human team that also reviews the content. There are many journalists that are involved in this kind of work. Rita, how do you approach this phenomenon of misinformation throughout the conference? A lot of people have spoken about the business, but as journalists, we have a trend to end up with the mediators, those who have a more direct contact with both sides. So to what extent is this not removing journalists from the scene? This would require a full conference just for this topic. We don't have the time. Yes, as you say, it's a very complicated issue. Journalistic mediation may have decreased a little in its protagonism because it was considered to be an authority in society to decide what is important or not. And this authority is now shared. And to this respect, there are new mediators, because there's always been mediation. It's been just transferred to other mediators. There's been a sort of a disintermediation that led to a complicated situation. But another important thing, in my opinion, is that to take the business side out of it, well, information is an industry, and it has its business side to it, but perhaps we should highlight real and contrasted information more. Some people say that they recognize, they can trust in news if it's highlighted in Google News. This works as a criterion to assess the credibility of information. But there's another dimension here that reflects that technology has its power. The other dimension of the misinformation industry that does not have the business side, it has the ideological facet to it. And it's a new problem for journalism. So when the political authority voices are the ones that themselves are creating fake news because there are no mediators. No, they may hold a press conference with international politicians and they are producing the fake news themselves. And this is a real social problem that then has its technological reflection. It's all about decoding, questioning, and becoming exposed. Yes, that's what I mean. There are other facets, different layers that make this process more difficult. Another thing that technology brought is that these politicians may speak directly to their followers via Twitter or whatever. It's not only Twitter, we have TikTok with more and more this kind of function. The underlying problem is that there are social problems without a technological solution. This is a technological conference. Some social problems don't have a technological solution. And the mistrust that exists in journalism is real. And misinformation and fake news feed this mistrust. And it's totally related to mistrust in politics. So the greater the mistrust in politics, and we know that it's increasing, the greater the erosion of the credibility of journalism and feeding one another for better and for worse. So anytime someone does not believe in the fake news, in misinformation, but they believe in the underlying values. So the information may be fake, but there's a value underlying to see and say that all politicians are corrupt and not to be trusted. So this is feeding back into the system. So even if it's stated that the information is not true, this creates a belief in that politics are corrupt and politicians are corrupt. And these people are not dissuaded. And this is a very deep-rooted cause. There are social problems that don't have a technological solution, but technology can help. Yes, we could go on forever about this, and Rita is right. We have the idea of media literacy, the idea that people are not born knowing how to read the news and understand it. We need to educate audiences and how to build society. It's also necessary to build media literacy. The younger generations perhaps are more prepared for this than we are, but associations in Portugal that have these mediators for young people and for elderly people to help them build media literacy. The Gulbenkian Foundation has a project for media literacy with funding by 25 million, and we need to do more things of this kind. Well, so let's wrap up because we're running out of time. So one last idea, just to refocus the discussion. This mistrust to politicians and journalists, it's the understanding a lot of people have, but they don't mistrust the social media. So it's easier to believe in a lie or a fake news than to believe a politician or a journalist. Well, there's a huge paradox precisely in all that. To be competent citizens, it's impossible for us to disconnect from technology, regardless of what we think about it. On the other hand, more and more, there is the paradox that people may even not trust social media at all. But the social media offset this by contact between people. It's easy to find the information you look for, even if it's about the weather. A lot of people look for the weather forecast on the internet if they go to travel, or they look for things to buy. So the utility and the social compensation is to maintain these emotional ties. If you throw this onto the balance, the people feel compensated even if they have some mistrust, and the information they get about all the scandals on Twitter, Facebook, and whatnot, people, the balance is tipped by the advantages. So we have a minute left for the future. The future in a minute. The conference says the future is now. We cannot think about the future being after now, but my question is, what about fact checks that many journalists perform to fight against fake news? It's yet another tool. We've always conducted fact checks, and the technology is helping us to perform them much faster. And it seems that we are all going to be activists for journalism in the digital world. But we have problems ahead of us. I think that in Portugal the reality is different to other places where digital literacy is different. In any case, I'd like to highlight the fact that journalism and information brands have to do their job properly. There is no one single way to do this. It's not going to end up in the next 48 seconds. But we have to conquer readership day after day, but not depending on the platforms, be it Google or other social media or whatever. This should not be the only way to direct readers. In fact, we should look at the platforms as a supplement to the way in which we have to instruct our people. So to conclude, for a long time, people were used to reading news for free, and they think digital journalism is something free, but it's not free. It costs money. It costs a lot of money. And this trend to this culture is changing. People are now more willing to pay. Was there any changes with the pandemic? Yes, the situation is changing. It's not just the will to pay, but the conditions to pay. And the socio-economic context, of course, there's this mistrust towards politicians and journalists that builds a barrier to this will to pay. When I conducted a program, I had a goal that was to support journals and journalism. So I said, instead of paying the journals themselves, there should be tax incentives, and so the taxpayers would be the ones to fund this. So thank you to the three of you for speaking about digital journalism or journalism in the digital age. So now let's go on to another discussion in this conference. We're going to learn the impressions of the three major communication groups.